So, again, it's an honor to serve you in some small way. So, last night we saw from Pastor Paul that God has spoken, and his words have been guaranteed to us by authorized agents that we call the prophets. All of you know about 007, James Bond. He's an authorized agent. He's authorized to kill. But the prophets of the Old Testament and the apostles of the New were authorized agents. They were authorized to speak for God. And my argument last night, which I didn't make very clear, but I will make clear now in two sentences. What I tried to show two things. I tried to show that according to Jewish tradition, the canon of the Old Testament was closed by the 2nd century BC, if not by the 4th century BC. So remember the books. Remember from Maccabees, after the Maccabean War, Judas gathered the books, and he said he was doing this in the same way that Nehemiah had done 2 centuries earlier. So if we accept that testimony, we see that according to Jewish tradition, the catalog of books of the Old Testament was closed and finished by the 4th century AD. And the second thing that I tried to show is that Jesus accepted that tradition. Jesus accepted that tradition. He spoke about the law and the prophets and the Psalms. So he's referring to this collection of books that we call the Old Testament. And since Jesus accepted it, that makes it binding for me because I am a follower of Jesus Christ. So that in a nutshell is the argument. So now we're going to look at the history of the writing of the Old Testament text, and the question is what they wrote then, is what we have now what they wrote then? So the authors of the Old Testament produced their work between the 15th and 4th centuries BC. So I would follow my dating for the Exodus would be early, and I would date the Exodus to around 1450 BC. And I accept that Moses wrote the bulk of the Pentateuch. So the authors of the Old Testament produced their work between the 15th and 4th centuries BC. How can we know that the final form of the text has been transmitted to us in a reliable and trustworthy manner? So there are a lot of people, there are a lot of scholars who say, well, they didn't even know how the Hebrew people didn't even know how to write in the 15th century BC. First, we must know what sources have survived, whether copies of originals in Hebrew and Aramaic, or whether ancient translations. So the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew and Aramaic, and then it was also, there are also ancient translations which we call versions. I'm going to talk about them. Second, we must understand the history of the transmission of the text. And the word understand here is all important because the data are not self-interpreting. All right, so you can, this isn't working here, so how do I get it to work? Here, let's see if we can get it to work. There we go. The history of the writing of the Old Testament text. We're in business. Okay. I begin with a brief sketch of Hebrew writing. Before the invention of the printing press, around 1450 AD, all books were copied by hand. We call books created in this way manuscripts, a term that comes from two Latin words. Scriptus means written, and manu means by hand. So a manuscript is a book that was written by hand. Producing books was painstaking and slow work. In 692 AD, Monk Wearmouth Jarrow Abbey in England was granted additional land to raise 200 head of cattle. Why did they need 200 head of cattle? To provide parchment, animal skins, for the ambitious project of producing 3 complete illustrated Bibles. And later on I will show you a picture of one of those Bibles. Bede, you may have heard of the Venerable Bede, was undoubtedly involved in this task, which took more than 2 decades to complete. So it took them over 20 years to make 3 copies of the Latin Bible. The great Isaiah scroll from Qumran required as many as 17 sheepskins for just one book of the Old Testament. So books didn't come very easily. At the earliest stage of writing the biblical text in Hebrew, only consonants were represented. And this may seem strange to you, but Hebrew writing only represented consonants. This is a reliable way of writing, since context determines readings that are uncertain. Israeli newspapers are still written this way. So Israeli newspapers, the writing in Israeli newspapers record the consonants, but they don't record the vowels, okay? This system, correct pronunciation of the biblical text, moreover, was passed down orally from priest to priest and from scribe to scribe. Later in the 9th century BC, letters representing 3 of the consonants were given a double function to represent long vowels as well. This system, however, was not consistent or systematic, and moreover did not represent all the vowels. Much later, during the period 700 to 1000 AD, Jewish scholars called Masoretes developed a system of dots or points to go over and under the letters. These points represented all the vowels and also the accents. There are at least 27 different accents that they use. Early Hebrew writing employed a script similar to that used by the ancient Phoenicians. Later, under the influence of the Chaldean kings of Babylon, so you've heard of Nebuchadnezzar, he led the Aramaic or Chaldean kings of Babylon. Scribes switched to using the Aramaic script. So the Aramaic script is basically the same alphabet as the Hebrew alphabet, and you can use the Aramaic script to represent Hebrew writing. So there's a picture of someone preparing a goat skin for use as writing material. This is a picture of archaic Hebrew script. So this is Genesis 1:1, Bereshith bara Elohim eth ha-shamayim wa eth ha'aretz, and this is possibly what it looked like around 1000 BC. And we know that, the way we know that is from inscriptions that we have from about this time. This is the same text in the Aramaic square script, which was adopted in the 5th century BC. And this shows you, if you look very carefully, you can see dots in the letters, under the letters, and over the letters. Those dots represent the vowels that are supposed to go with the consonants. So between 700 and 1000 AD, the Masoretes, they didn't want to add letters to the alphabet that were when the Greeks actually borrowed the alphabet from the Phoenicians, and then they added signs for vowels that were the same size as the other letters. But the Masoretes didn't want to add letters to the text, so they put little dots in the letters, under the letters, and over the letters to represent the vowels and accents. This is, you may have heard of Hezekiah's Tunnel. Have most of you heard of Hezekiah's Tunnel? So around 700 BC, the Assyrians were attacking Jerusalem, and the problem is that the only source of water, the main spring that supplies water for the whole town, is outside the city wall. And when there's an Assyrian army, you can't pay a water boy to go out and get water. So Hezekiah prepared for that siege by digging a tunnel over 500 meters long, 1,500 feet long, that goes from the Gihon spring into the pool of Siloam. And at the end of the tunnel, just before you get into the Siloam, the pool of Siloam, they carved an inscription on the wall that actually tells the story of how they dug the tunnel. They dug the tunnel from both ends and met in the middle, so it was an early engineering feat. And so there's another picture that gives you a better idea of what these letters look like. Second to last line says Hamayim. It begins with the word Hamayim, so that's how to read that. And it talks about the water coming from the upper pool down to the lower pool. So do you see the dots? I've circled some dots in red. Can you see those dots that I've circled in red? Those are word dividers. Those are word dividers. So they didn't use this text. This inscription uses dots to divide the words. It's important to have spacing. What does this say? God is nowhere, or God is now here. So spacing can determine the meaning of the message. This is an example of using. I tried to use an example of how you would write English without any vowels. So this isn't. You could make this out. This is the background slide on the consonantal text. So if you saw BCKGRND, it would be obvious that the word is background, correct? If you see the word THS, it could be this or thus or these or those. But remember, words don't occur by themselves. They always occur in sentences. Once it occurs in a sentence, there's really only one possible meaning. So it's not so difficult an idea to represent writing using only consonants. Let's see I don't know really where I am here. Let's see how far this goes. Let's just go through these things. So this is what we call the Paleo-Hebrew Leviticus scroll from Qumran Cave 11. So last night I mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls on the northeastern corner. The northwestern corner of the Dead Sea. They discovered this archaeological site. A group of people lived there from about 250 BC to the time of Jesus or so, and they found these caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And this is called the Paleo-Hebrew Leviticus scroll from Qumran Cave 11. Here's a close-up. This shows you that some of the text, they were still using the archaic script, the same kind of script that you see in the Hezekiah Tunnel inscription. Let me just see if I can read this for you. Not the top line, but starting on the next line. it says, Haaretz will lo taki haaretz. So this is a passage from Leviticus 18 or 19 where it says that if you disobey the commands in the covenant that God is making, the land will vomit you out. Okay, very thrilling passage, but there it is. And you can, if you look carefully, you can see that there are dots. There are dots between the letters. So they're using dots as word dividers. Many of you may already know about papyrus, using papyrus as a writing surface. So these are the bulrushes or the reeds that grow by the Nile River. We talked about reeds last night. You cut the stem, you peel the rind, and then you slice it into strips. And then you put one layer of strips horizontally and one layer of strips vertically on a flat stone, cover it with a cloth, pound it with a mallet till the fibers mesh together, and then when it dries, polish it with a polishing stone. And so that's how papyrus was made. This shows you a wax tablet. So basically it's made out of wood, so that the frame is wood, and they would cover it with wax, and then you would have a sharp stylus, and you could carve the letters in the wax. So what you would do is you can see there are holes. So there are holes. So you could have 4 or 5 of these, and you could take a leather strap and tie a bunch of these together. It would give you an arm load. You could go down to the racetrack or go down to the forum and do your business, carve it in the wax, and then when you got home, you could transfer it to a papyrus using ink. And so these were very common. This is a precursor of the codex. So the most that we've seen is maybe 10 or 12 of these things. If you had 10 or 12 of them, that would be quite an arm load. Well, somebody got the idea that if you instead of using a scroll, if you cut sheets of papyrus and folded them together and sewed them along here, you could make a papyrus notebook. And then somebody got the idea that if you sewed a bunch of these together, you could make a codex. So this happened at the end of the first century. At the end of the first century AD, they invented the codex. And Paul actually talks about this. So you know this famous passage where Paul is writing to Timothy and saying, bring the books and especially the parchments. I'm quoting the King James Version. Do you know that passage? Bring the books and especially the parchments. The books were probably scrolls of the Old Testament text, and the parchments were probably papyrus notebooks containing Paul's own letters, or they would be the texts of the New Testament, which were written on papyrus notebooks. Some of our earliest documents are papyrus notebooks. And here's a picture of a codex. So this was a brand new piece of technology by 100 AD, and by the 4th century AD, we could actually make books big enough to hold the whole Bible. But that took 300 years to develop the technology. And I'm going to show you in my lecture this afternoon that Christians were actually on the forefront of this new technology. So most of the codices in the first 600 or 700 years were from Christians. The non-Christians were very slow to adopt this new technology. All right, modern printed Hebrew Bibles. So Biblia, what we call Biblia Hebraica, published in 1905 to 1906 and edited by Rudolf Kittel, was the first edition of the Hebrew Bible that included in a systematic way evidence from ancient translations. It was based on the text of the Second Rabbinic Bible, printed in 1524-1525, which in turn was based on 12th century Masoretic manuscripts. The third edition of Biblia Hebraica, 1929 to 1937, was the first modern printed Bible to be based on manuscript B19A in the National Library of Russia, St. Petersburg, from 1008 AD. Also known as the Leningrad Codex, it is the oldest manuscript that contains the complete Old Testament. And I have so out by your donuts, I have a photographic facsimile of this manuscript. So you want, if in the break, you can go out and get a cup of coffee and look at a photographic facsimile of the oldest complete manuscript of the Hebrew Bible, 1008 AD. This manuscript was chosen because it is closest to the text of the famous Aleppo Codex in the parts where it survives. So the Aleppo Codex was produced by the famous Ben Asher family of the Tiberian Masoretes around 930 AD, and since 1948 is missing the Torah. So when Israel became a nation in 1948, there were riots against the Jews in Aleppo. The synagogue was set on fire. It was thought the manuscript was lost. They recovered it, but the Torah or Pentateuch part is missing. The third edition of Biblia Hebraica also included readings from the Dead Sea Scrolls. The current edition of Biblia Hebraica is Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, or BHS, and a fifth edition is now being produced. The newer editions improve only the apparatus or footnotes. So the text of our Hebrew Bible, if you want to buy a text of the Hebrew Bible, the text that we're using today is the text of this manuscript that's on display out in the foyer. By the way, this talk contains an enormous number of details. Don't worry about that. Just try to get a flavor. Just try to get a flavor for for every man who copied the text and did his job well. Okay, that's the general idea that we're aiming at. So, textual criticism, the history of the text involves a massive amount of details, and you can easily get lost in them. The Masoretic text. There's a picture of the Second Rabbinic Bible that was printed in 1524 and 1525. And you can see that it's really an early version of the study Bible. So the column in the middle on the left, is the actual Hebrew text. The column to the right is the Aramaic Targum or translation. So we'll talk about those. So there's an Aramaic translation, and then all around the text are the oldest Jewish commentaries from the 10th and 11th and 12th centuries. So this was one of the early versions of what you would call a study Bible. Let's see. I don't know why these things are in the order they're in. Okay. We talked about, I said that between 700 and 1000 AD, they invented these little squiggles and dots to put in the letters, over the letters, and under the letters to show the vowels. There are actually three systems: Tiberian, Palestinian, Babylonian. And there are two famous families of Masoretes, the Ben Asher family and the Ben Naphtali family. So the Aleppo Codex was actually produced by Aharon Ben Asher. And I have a copy of that at home too, but these books weigh 30 pounds each, and so I only brought one with me this morning. but you're welcome to come to my house and look at them. The following chart lists our earliest manuscripts. So we have about a dozen manuscripts before 1100. As the Aleppo Codex is there, it's not. It says it includes all of the Old Testament, but the Pentateuch portion is missing. The Leningrad Codex is complete. Most of the other manuscripts have only the Torah or the prophets or the writings. So not all of these manuscripts are complete. After 1100, I don't know how many manuscripts, but there are at least 3,000 manuscripts from the Middle Ages. So we have lots of copies of the Hebrew Bible. And all of them attest the same textual tradition. So there's very little variation between these 3,000 manuscripts. Now we're going to look at evidence for the text before the Masoretes. Evidence for the text before the Masoretes. Before 1900, we had no Hebrew manuscripts prior to the Masoretes around 1000 AD. Two discoveries changed all this, and we are just beginning to evaluate the new materials. So first of all, the text from the Judean desert. Early attestation to the text changed considerably in the 20th century with the discovery of what are commonly called the Dead Sea Scrolls. Manuscripts were found at about a dozen different places, most coming from caves around Qumran at the northeast. Why do I say northeast? It looks to me like it's northwest. Isn't it northwest? So there's a mistake in my manuscript here. I'm always finding mistakes made by myself. Most humiliating. This discovery entails fragments of some 930 texts, of which approximately 200 are biblical books, all dated generally between 250 BC and 130 AD. Some texts were written in Greek and Aramaic, although the majority are written in Hebrew. Most Hebrew texts are written in the square script, although we have about a dozen manuscripts, mostly of the Pentateuch, that are written in the old archaic Hebrew script. The official publication is the Oxford series, Discoveries in the Judean Desert, and I just happened to own that. One of my professors gave me half of it, and I bought the other half. So it's 40 volumes, so I have at my house all of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Unfortunately, you asked me to talk about something that I'm really into, so I'm into all this. Secondly, we see that there are manuscripts found at Qumran, at the Wadi Ed-Dalia, at the Wadi Miraba'at, the Nachal Chever, the Nachal Se'alim, and at Masada. All right, this shows you how many copies. So, for example, it's for the book of Genesis, there are 16 or 17 copies, but that doesn't mean copies of the whole book of Genesis. It could be just a fragment. It could be one page. It could be several pages or parts of a scroll. So it gives you how many copies we have of each book and in the square script and in the Paleo-Hebrew script. This shows you for the writings the same thing. All right, let's just cover this. I'm not sure how all of this works. We also have. I was one of the first people to actually draw attention to this. We have a number of important manuscripts from the 3rd century to the 7th century AD, and here's a list of them. Notice one of them is a burned scroll from Ein Gedi. And you can look this up on the internet. So the scroll is burned, but they used a computer to look inside it, they used a computer to digitally unroll it, or virtually unroll it, and show what the writing was. Here's a picture of two of these. Here's a fragment from Cambridge. So another cache of important witnesses was discovered at the end of the 19th century in the Geniza of the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Old Cairo, now preserved in the Taylor Schechter collection in the Cambridge University Library. So, so for Americans, one of the things that we know as Americans is there's a proper procedure for dealing with a worn-out flag. So when a flag is worn out, you don't just put it in the garbage or the trash. There's a proper procedure for dealing with it. And the same applies to worn-out scrolls. So when the Jewish people were using a scroll, if it became too worn out to use, they didn't just throw it in the garbage or the trash. There was a room at the back of the synagogue called a Geniza. Ganaz means to store away. So this is the place where you store things away. And at the end of the 1800s, around 1900, there was a Geniza behind the old synagogue in Cairo. They broke into it and found hundreds of manuscripts that are before 900, many of which are before 900 AD. Of some 200,000 documents, 24,700 fragments are biblical texts. And you can be sure that not all of these have been studied, even in the last 100 years. Catalogs containing complete description of these texts appeared between 1978 and 2003. So we weren't even finished cataloging them till 2003. These are important proto-Masoretic texts, early versions of the Masoretic text. They have not been analyzed fully, nor is their witness included systematically in our printed Hebrew Bibles. We also know of some 8 manuscripts from the 3rd to 7th centuries, all of which attest the later Masoretic text. So these manuscripts, here's the Ashkar-Gilson manuscript from the 7th century AD, parts of which are kept at Duke University in Durham. Is that correct? Durham, North Carolina. So, what's very interesting is these early manuscripts are identical to our later Masoretic text. Ancient versions. So we're going to talk about ancient versions. The Samaritan Pentateuch. When the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC, they deported the Israelites and imported other peoples. So this was the Assyrian practice. When they conquered someone, they took the people away and put them somewhere else. They brought other people in. And those other people intermarried with the Israelis who were left in the land, and the result is what we call the Samaritans. This is the origin of the Samaritan people. Relations between the Jews and Samaritans were, from the beginning up until about 128, relations between Jews and Samaritans they went through kind of an on and an off situation. Sometimes the relations were good, sometimes the relations were bad. But in 128 BC, John Hyrcanus, who was one of the Maccabees, destroyed Shechem, and that finished it. So after 128 BC, there were terribly bad relations between Jews and Samaritans, which is what you see recorded in the New Testament. When you read the New Testament, you see those bad dealings between the Jews and the Samaritans. Only the Pentateuch is recognized by the Samaritans. So they're a bit like the Sadducees. They only recognize the Torah or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. The Samaritan Pentateuch, therefore, is a version of the Torah transmitted among the Samaritans in isolation from the Jews from the 2nd century BC onwards. Okay, so this is very interesting. If you look at this, I know you can't make heads or tails out of it, but what you might see here is they're using the old archaic script. So they never changed to the Aramaic square script. They're sort of like the Amish, preserving the old culture. You have 3 columns. One is the Hebrew, one is Hebrew, one is Aramaic, and one is Arabic, and they're all written in the old Hebrew script. So not only do they preserve the archaic Hebrew script, but they're writing the Aramaic in the old Hebrew script, and they're writing Arabic in the old Hebrew script. So these are the Amish par excellence, okay? Now this is very important. When the Samaritan Pentateuch is compared to the Masoretic text, so we compare the Samaritan Pentateuch to our later Masoretic text, it represents an updated form of the text. And I will go into a lot of detail. It is characterized by replacing archaic forms, grammar, and vocabulary in Hebrew with those of a later linguistic tradition. So it's like changing thou and thee to you and ye, or to even yous or y'alls or youans, So do you understand what I'm trying to say? They're updating the grammar, they're updating the language, they're updating the vocabulary, they're updating the geographical references, they're modernizing the text. So, this is very important. If the Samaritan Pentateuch goes back to the 2nd century BC, and it represents a modernization of the text, then the Masoretic text, if the Masoretic text had to be modernized in the 2nd century BC, then the Masoretic text is very old. You see that? The Masoretic text was not modernized. So even though our oldest manuscripts for the Masoretic text are from around 1000 AD, the Samaritan Pentateuch shows that this text had to be modernized 1200 years earlier. So it's a tremendous argument for the antiquity of the text that you're looking at out in the foyer. The Old Greek and the later Greek versions. The Old Greek or Septuagint, okay, I've got to keep my eye on the time here. The Old Greek or Septuagint refers to a translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. The Pentateuch was translated early in the time of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who ruled between 285 and 240 in Alexandria, Egypt. The rest of the books were probably translated by 130 BC, as we saw last night from the prologue to Ben Sira, because he talks about Ben Sira and he compares it to the translation in Greek. The name Septuagint comes from the Latin word Septuaginta, which means 70, because there's a legend about 70 translators. Whether this legend is probably just part of propaganda. So there was a lot of pamphlets going back and forth when this translation came out. So the Jews what happened? Do you remember Acts chapter 2? What happens in Acts chapter 2? All the Jews come from all over the world to celebrate Passover. So you can imagine. Now, let's imagine what happens. We have Jews from Alexandria, and we have Jews living in Israel. And the Jews in Israel are saying, you can't read Hebrew, and they're saying, if our translation is good enough for Paul, it's good enough for us, you see. So there were kind of pamphlets going back and forth saying, the Septuagint is no good, and they're saying, yes, the Septuagint is good. It was translated by 70 of our best scholars from our best manuscripts. They went into pairs, and they all translated in cells. When they came out of the cells, they all had the identical translation, so it must come from God. So this is like a lot of our pamphlets about translations that came out between 1970 and 1990, if you remember that era. Individual books vary in quality and character and quality of translation. So some parts of the translation are very literal, like the New American Standard Bible, if you're familiar with that. And some are much more dynamic translations, like the NIV or the New Living Translation. So each book in the Greek Old Testament was translated by a different translator, and they represent different kinds of translations. To complicate matters, long before all of the books had been translated, revisions were being made of existing translations. So before they even finished the project of translation, they were already bringing out, the American Standard Version, the New American Standard Bible, the Revised Standard Version, the New Revised Standard Version. They were already bringing out revisions. And when the Christian church was born, they adopted the Septuagint as their Bible because they didn't know Hebrew. And when they tried to prove that Jesus was the Messiah out of the Greek translation, the Jews would say, well, that's not a very good translation. So they revised the translation. So there are Jewish revisions of the Septuagint by Theodotion, by Aquila, and by Symmachus. All right. Here, the Latin Bible. There are several Latin translations. There's an early Latin translation that we call the Old Latin, and then there's a later Latin translation that was made by Jerome between 390 and 410. And Jerome was almost the only person who, in that period of time, who knew Hebrew. He learned Hebrew. He started with Hebrew manuscripts, and he translated the Bible from Hebrew into Latin. And this is Codex Amiatinus. It's the oldest complete Latin Bible, and it dates from like 618 A.D. And here's a picture of it. It's over a foot thick, and it took 515 calfskins remember I quoted earlier, they were buying land so they could have more cows. Well, now you know why they needed more cows. And there's a picture this is a picture of Ezra copying the Bible in the front of that. Here's a picture of Syriac. So the Peshitta is given to the standard translation of the Bible into Syriac, which is a dialect of Aramaic. So if you can imagine, between 200 AD and 1200 AD, there was a Christian empire speaking Aramaic or Syriac in the country that we now call Turkey. The Turkish government has done everything possible to change the names of the ancient places into different names so that you will not recognize your Christian heritage in Turkey. Now, this translation happened very early, 2nd or 3rd century. So it's one of the oldest translations. They translated it from Hebrew into Syriac. Aramaic Targums. The word Targum means translation. It was customary in Talmudic times from the 3rd and 4th century to translate biblical readings in synagogue simultaneously from Hebrew into Aramaic. Tradition traced this practice back to Ezra's public reading of the law, but I think that's just legend. The truth of the matter is this: Hebrew died as a living language around 150 A.D. And so after 150 A.D., when Jews worshipped in the synagogue, it would be like, I don't know if some of you can remember 1960. So back when I was growing up in Quebec in 1960, the church in Quebec was Roman Catholic. They were reading the Bible in Latin, but nobody understood it. Well, if they read the Bible in Hebrew in 150, nobody would be able to understand it, so they would have to have translations into Aramaic. And eventually these translations were written down. All right, let's see. 15 more minutes? Okay. Okay, let's see what I've got. Here's what I want to do. When we look at our oldest, I want to briefly talk about our oldest witnesses, and then I want to try to give some time for questions, Cass. So I'm just going to wing this part here. So if we look at our earliest manuscripts, so we're talking here about the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are two interpretations. One is the interpretation of most scholars. The interpretation of most scholars in the world is that there's a great variety in the manuscripts, and that the text was not standardized until the 2nd century A.D. Then there's the view of Peter Gentry, and it's literally Peter Gentry against the whole world, okay? And I've published on this. I believe that there was a standard text all along. And what I believe is that when you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, you see two kinds of texts. There's two kinds of copying. One kind of copying is where they copy exactly as they see it. So they copy the layout, they copy the letters, they copy the text exactly, letter for letter, exactly as they see it. We call that repetition. The other kind of copying is what we're going to call resignification. And that means the scribe says to himself, if I don't change from the archaic script to the Aramaic square script, my children won't be able to read this text. If I don't update thou and thee to y'all, my children aren't going to understand this text. So they're doing grammatical updating, lexical updating, updating the vocabulary, they're modernizing the text. So these kinds of texts do not represent variation from the standard text. They represent modernizing an archaic text. Here's an example. This is very, very special. This is the Masada Psalm Scroll, all right? This is Psalms 82 and 83, and it's from the 1st century BC, so maybe 25 BC. This text is letter for letter identical to the Aleppo Codex 1,000 years later. I hope that instills some confidence in you guys. How could they copy the text for 1,000 years? And there are basically maybe there are basically 6 differences, and they're all stupid mistakes, okay, that anybody would be able to figure out. Here's a close-up of it. So this is God. God sits in the assembly of the gods. Bekerev Elohim. So he sits in the midst of the gods. Psalm 82. I'm reading from the Hebrew text here for you. This is Codex Sinaiticus. And here's what's unbelievable. You know how Hebrew poetry is laid out into couplets? The couplets are indicated in the Masada Psalm Scroll by spacing, and the Greek translation preserves the same couplets 95% of the time, and that's 500 or 600 years after the translation was done. So even the Greek translation is preserving not only a good translation, but the poetic layout. Codex Vaticanus also preserves the same thing. All right, here's an example. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about updating. Here is Psalm 4 in the King James Version. How many of you can read this? O ye sons of men, how long will ye turn my glory into shame? How long will ye love vanity and seek after leasing? Does anyone in this room know what leasing means? All right. Do you know why some of the writing is in a different script? So you can see that there are a good number of people, even in the area in which we're living, who say, well, the King James Version is the only Bible for me, but I doubt they know how to read it. The King James Version went through 3 major revisions with over 100,000 changes, and here's what the same text looks like in a more recent printing. O ye sons of men, how long will you turn my glory into shame? How long will you love vanity and seek after leasing? Leasing has nothing to do with renting a car or house. It's an old English word for lying. Here's the New King James Version. How long will you love worthlessness and seek after falsehood? So I could compare this to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which was written in the 1500s. And if you just give me a moment, Jeff, I'm going to try an experiment here. If I have a sound file, will it come out? Well, let's try it. So here it is here.
Weeping and wailing, car and over sorrow, ignore noch, on even an de morrow quod marchent. I'm so doing other more that wedded been.
All right, so how many of you understood that? That's English only 500 years ago. So now you know it in the 2nd century. Here it is in more recent English. Okay, so by the 2nd century BC, there were parts of the Old Testament that were 1,000 years old. So it's no wonder that some of the scribes were trying to modernize the language. All right. We call these facilitating texts, the pre-Samaritan text, the reworked Pentateuch, the Book of Jubilees, the Temple Scroll, the Genesis Apocryphon, the commentary on Genesis A. These are all paraphrases of the text. That's what they are. And 10 years ago, I walked into a bookstore and I made a list of all the Bibles I could find. We have the same thing in our bookstores today. So some of the Bibles in our bookstores are exact translations, and many of them are modernizing, facilitating, updating, paraphrasing, interpreting. Let's see. I don't need to. This is an interesting example. This is the Great Isaiah Scroll from Qumran Cave 1, and you can see. Can you see the second line where there's dots above the letters? Well, he made a mistake, and his eye skipped from one line in pink in verse 8. It says the grass fades, the flower falls, because the breath of Yahweh blows upon it. Surely the people are grass. And then you have the same line. His eye skipped from one to the other, and he missed the part in between. But look what happened. He put those dots. He didn't have white out, so he put those dots in there to show that you're supposed to delete those letters. And then if you look, he wrote the missing text down the side column. Do you see that? Okay. I think I'm going to stop there. So what I want to say is, I know this is arrogant, but I think most of the scholars in the world are wrong. I think that when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, we don't see a great variation in the text. we see two kinds of writing. We see people copying the text exactly as it is, and we see people modernizing the text. And if I had time, I could actually prove, we can actually prove that the same scribe produced both kinds of texts. So the same person could do an exact copy, and he could modernize the text for his children. And so basically, this text is exactly the same as our later Masoretic text. And so the bottom line is, we should have tremendous confidence that the text was copied faithfully over this long period of time. All right, we've got a minute, or we've got some time for questions.
5 minutes, just maybe a couple. I can start with one. I've always heard 4,000. There's 400,000 variations. There's 400,000 errors in the Bible. 400,000.
That's probably the New Testament, and I'm going to talk about that this afternoon.
Okay.
We are definitely going to talk.
That's a different.
We're going to talk about Bart Ehrman, the greatest skeptic of the New Testament.
Going back to yesterday, the pseudo-pictography, and those are like we have known, like God, if God has spoken, then there's also lies. I mean, there's one thing you can't deny in the world, there's truth and there's lies. So the pseudo-picography, are those the ones that we have actually found proven, even scholars, that's forgery, that's someone who has put their name on something that got caught, I guess?
There are different opinions, but I didn't read. I'll give you this comment. So let me briefly describe that. The pseudepigrapha, it's Jewish literature written between 300 BC and 100 AD. So far, so good? So just because there was no inspiration, just because God wasn't speaking, doesn't mean the Jews stopped writing. They kept writing. They kept producing documents. What is most of this literature like? Most of this literature is heavily influenced by the book of Daniel. You know how Christians are into the book of Daniel, and they have all wild ideas. Well, that's basically what a lot of this literature is like. A lot of it is what we call apocalyptic literature. It's like the book of Revelation. They're dividing history into periods and trying to see when the culmination of history is going to come about, and how God is going to act on behalf of his people, and how his people are to be encouraged in time. So it's apocalyptic literature, and much of it is attributed to people who were alive during the time that God was speaking in order to give authority to it. So they called it the apocalypse of Adam, or the assumption of Isaiah, or the assumption of Moses, or the book of Enoch. They put those names on it because they knew that God wasn't speaking in their time, and if they could attach the name of a person from an earlier time, it would lend authenticity and authority. They were looking for authority. So that the pseudepigrapha, we call it pseudepigrapha because it means false writings, right? They're writing under a false pen name. You get that? So this is actually negative evidence that God is no longer speaking, because they know it and they're trying to claim it. Does that make sense? Is that a helpful description of this kind of literature? So I didn't know in 1981 I went to get my PhD, and I wanted to study Greek and Hebrew. I didn't want to be an Old Testament scholar, and I didn't want to be a New Testament scholar. I wanted to study the whole Bible, and I wanted Greek and Hebrew, and so I thought if I studied Septuagint, I would have to study Greek and Hebrew. And I didn't know what I was getting myself into. I had to study the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha.
One more question, anybody else? So, I do have a question.
Yes, for sure.
The scribes at Qumran, how were they managed? How were they governed? Because it sounds like what you presented, that a scribe would have the opportunity to just write a new translation on their own.
Yes, and that's exactly what we see. And so some scholars today say, see, there's they're, in my view, they're not interpreting the data correctly. Their interpretation is there was no standard text. And I'm saying, yes, there was a standard text, because listen to this, I hope this idea makes, I want to make sure that everybody understands the logic of it. If a text that is modernized presupposes a standard text. You see that logic? So if you have a modernized text, you can't have a modernized text unless you have a standard text. And so if we understand that these documents are actually modernizations of the Masoretic, of a proto-Masoretic text, then it means there was a standard text there all along. I'm not saying that that text is perfect, that there aren't problems in it, that there aren't different places where there are problems, and that we have to solve those problems. I'm not getting away from that at all, but I'm just saying there was a standard text, and the text was not, I disagree with the rest of the world, the text was not standardized in the first century. They inherited a standard text.